Have you ever wondered what it would take for someone to completely abandon everything they were taught to believe? What would drive a southern plantation owner to make a decision so radical it would shake the very foundations of society? Today, I'm going to tell you an extraordinary story of courage, justice, and redemption that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about human nature. Before we begin this incredible journey, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss stories like this one. The Georgia sun beat down mercilessly on Whitmore Plantation in the summer of 1859, casting long shadows across the cotton fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. Eleanor Whitmore stood on the wraparound porch of the grand antebellum mansion, her weathered hands gripping the white-painted railing as she watched the enslaved workers move through the rows like ghosts in the shimmering heat. At 62, Eleanor had spent most of her life as the dutiful wife of plantation owner Jeremiah Whitmore, a man whose reputation for cruelty extended far beyond the borders of their 3,000-acre estate. For 40 years, she had turned a blind eye to the horrors that funded their lavish lifestyle, convincing herself that this was simply the natural order of things. The way it had always been, the way it would always be. The mansion itself stood as a testament to the wealth built on human suffering. Its towering white columns, imported marble floors, and crystal chandeliers from France had all been purchased with money earned from the sweat and blood of enslaved people. Eleanor had once taken pride in the elegant dinner parties she hosted, where the finest families of Georgia society would gather to discuss politics, literature, and business, while being served by silent figures in crisp white uniforms, people whose names she had never bothered to learn, whose stories she had never thought to ask. But everything changed 3 weeks ago when Jeremiah collapsed in his study, clutching his chest as a massive heart attack claimed his life. In the days that followed, as Eleanor sorted through his personal effects, she discovered a locked drawer in his mahogany desk. Inside, she found documents that would shatter everything she thought she knew about her family's fortune. The papers revealed the true extent of Jeremiah's business dealings, not just the buying and selling of human beings, but detailed records of families torn apart, children sold away from their mothers, and punishments so severe they defied human decency. There were receipts for the purchase of pregnant women, valued specifically for their breeding potential. Some correspondence with other plantation owners discussing the most efficient methods of breaking the spirit of newly acquired slaves. One document particularly haunted her, a bill of sale for a young woman named Grace and her 3 children. The notation in Jeremiah's handwriting read, "Sold children separately to maximize profit. Mother became unmanageable after separation. Recommend immediate resale." Eleanor remembered Grace vaguely, a quiet woman who had worked in the house until she suddenly disappeared one day. Eleanor had been told she had been transferred to another plantation, but now she understood the brutal reality behind that euphemism. Another file contained detailed records of punishments meted out for various infractions: 20 lashes for speaking without permission, 50 lashes for attempting to learn to read, 100 lashes for trying to run away. The clinical nature of the documentation made it even more horrifying. These weren't the actions of a man consumed by rage, but the calculated cruelty of someone who saw human suffering as a necessary business expense. But it was the final document that broke Eleanor's heart completely. A letter from her own son, Thomas, written to his father just months before Jeremiah's death. In it, Thomas outlined his plans to expand the plantation's operations, proposing the construction of additional slave quarters and the purchase of 50 more enslaved people. He wrote with cold calculation about maximizing productivity and minimizing overhead costs, referring to human beings as if they were nothing more than livestock. The letter also contained Thomas's thoughts on discipline and control, suggesting even harsher punishments for those who showed signs of insubordination. He proposed separating families as a matter of policy, arguing that emotional attachments made slaves less efficient and more likely to cause trouble. Reading her son's words, Eleanor felt as if she were looking into the face of a stranger, or perhaps for the first time seeing him clearly. "Mother, you look troubled," came a voice from behind her. Eleanor turned to see Thomas approaching, his expensive suit immaculate despite the oppressive heat. At 35, he possessed his father's sharp features and calculating eyes, but none of the warmth that Eleanor remembered from his childhood. His dark hair was slicked back with pomade, and his gold pocket watch, a gift from his father, caught the sunlight as he moved. "I've been thinking about your father's will," Eleanor said carefully, studying her son's face. "About the future of this place." Thomas smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "There's nothing to worry about, Mother. I've already spoken with the lawyers. The transition will be seamless. In fact, I have plans that will make this plantation more profitable than Father ever imagined." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine despite the sweltering heat. "What kind of plans, Thomas?" "Expansion, Mother. I've identified several neighboring properties we can acquire, and I've already arranged for the purchase of additional workers. We could double our cotton production within 2 years. He paused, his voice taking on an edge of excitement that made Eleanor's stomach turn. Father was too conservative. He didn't understand the true potential of what we have here. With the right investments and proper management techniques, we could become the most profitable plantation in all of Georgia. Thomas began pacing the porch, his enthusiasm growing as he outlined his vision. "I've been corresponding with plantation owners in Mississippi and Alabama who have developed new methods of motivation. They've seen productivity increases of 30% or more, and I found a dealer in Charleston who can provide us with prime stock at excellent prices." The casual way he spoke of human beings as stock made Eleanor feel physically ill. She gripped the railing tighter, her knuckles white with tension. As Thomas continued outlining his vision, speaking of human beings as commodities, of families as breeding stock, of children as future investments, Eleanor felt something fundamental shift inside her. She looked past her son toward the fields, where she could see Sarah, a young woman barely 20 years old, carrying water to the workers while her infant son was strapped to her back. Just last week, Thomas had mentioned his intention to sell Sarah's husband to a plantation in Alabama, separating the young family forever. "The key," Thomas was saying, "is to eliminate emotional attachments that interfere with productivity, separate families early, before bonds become too strong. Rotate workers between different tasks to prevent them from developing expertise that might make them feel indispensable. And most importantly, maintain absolute authority through swift and severe punishment of any infractions." Eleanor watched Sarah in the distance, seeing the way she moved carefully to avoid jostling her sleeping baby. The tender way she adjusted the cloth that protected him from the sun. This was someone's daughter, someone's wife, someone's mother, not a piece of property to be manipulated for maximum profit. "Thomas," Eleanor interrupted, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. "What if there was another way?" Her son's expression hardened. "Another way? Mother, this is our legacy. This is what the Whitmore name represents. Surely you're not suggesting we abandon everything Father built?" Eleanor met his gaze directly. "I'm suggesting we consider what kind of legacy we truly want to leave behind." That evening, Eleanor sat alone in Jeremiah's study. The damning documents spread across the desk before her. The weight of 40 years of complicity pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. She thought about all the faces she had seen over the decades, the children who had grown up in bondage, the mothers who had wept for their sold-away babies, the men who had worked themselves to exhaustion in the fields while she lived in comfort. The room itself seemed to mock her newfound awareness. The leather-bound books on the shelves, the expensive Persian rug beneath her feet, the oil paintings of Whitmore ancestors on the walls. All of it purchased with money earned from human misery. She wondered how many families had been torn apart to pay for the mahogany desk where she now sat. How many lives had been destroyed to afford the crystal decanter that held Jeremiah's finest whiskey. She picked up her late husband's fountain pen and pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her. With trembling hands, she began to write what would become the most important document of her life, a new will that would change everything. As she wrote, she could hear the sounds of the plantation settling into evening, the lowing of cattle, the creak of the old house, the distant sound of voices from the slave quarters. Outside her window, she could hear the faint sound of singing drifting from the slave quarters. It was a spiritual she had heard countless times before, but tonight the words seemed to carry a different meaning. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Eleanor paused in her writing, listening to the voices that rose and fell in perfect harmony despite the suffering that surrounded them. These people had maintained their humanity, their dignity, their hope, even in the face of unimaginable cruelty. They deserved so much more than the life that had been forced upon them. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, filled with a longing that spoke to something deep in Eleanor's soul. She realized that in all her years on the plantation, she had heard this music countless times, but had never really listened to it. Now, as the voices carried across the night air, she understood that these songs were more than just entertainment. They were expressions of faith, hope, and an unbreakable human spirit that no amount of cruelty could destroy. As the last notes of the song faded into the night, Eleanor returned to her writing with renewed determination. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of righting 40 years of wrongs. Tomorrow, she would choose justice over tradition, humanity over profit, love over legacy. The old Eleanor Whitmore, the woman who had stood silently by while atrocities were committed in her name, would die with the setting sun. In her place would rise someone new, a woman ready to sacrifice everything for the chance at redemption. The morning sun filtered through the Spanish moss hanging from the ancient oak trees as Eleanor made her way to the slave quarters for the first time in her adult life. The small wooden cabins, weathered grey by years of neglect, stood in stark contrast to the grandeur of the main house. As she approached, conversation stopped and faces turned toward her with a mixture of surprise and wariness. The quarters themselves told a story of deliberate deprivation. The cabins were cramped, housing entire families in spaces no larger than a single room in the main house. The roofs leaked, evidenced by the buckets and pans strategically placed to catch rainwater. The windows were small and few, making the interiors dark and poorly ventilated. Eleanor noticed that many of the buildings needed repairs that had been ignored for years. Loose boards, sagging porches, broken steps that made daily life unnecessarily difficult and dangerous. Between the cabins, small gardens struggled to grow in the hard-packed earth. These tiny plots represented the enslaved people's attempts to supplement their meager rations with vegetables they grew themselves, working by moonlight after their official duties were done. Eleanor saw collard greens, sweet potatoes, and beans growing in neat rows, tended with the same care that these people brought to the plantation's cotton fields, but for their own family's survival. "Morning, Mrs. Whitmore," said an elderly man named Moses, removing his worn hat. At 73, he was the oldest person on the plantation, having been born into slavery and never knowing any other life. His back was permanently bent from decades of labor, but his eyes remained sharp and kind. Eleanor noticed the deep lines etched in his face, each one telling a story of hardship endured with dignity. "Good morning, Moses," Eleanor replied, her voice softer than usual. I was hoping to speak with everyone. Could you gather the others? Moses nodded slowly, his weathered hands replacing his hat. Yes, sir, might take a few minutes to get everyone together. Some folks are already out in the fields, others tending to the animals. No. As Moses moved between the cabins, calling softly to the inhabitants, Eleanor observed the morning routine of the quarters. Women emerged carrying water buckets, heading to the well that served the entire community. Children, some barely old enough to walk, played in the dirt with toys made from scraps of wood and cloth. Older children helped their mothers prepare breakfast over small fires, the smoke rising in thin columns into the morning air. Within minutes, nearly 50 people had assembled in the small clearing between the cabins. Eleanor looked at each face. Some she recognized. Others were strangers, despite living on the same property for years. There was Sarah with her baby, a teenage boy named Samuel, who reminded her painfully of Thomas at that age, and an older woman named Ruth, whose hands bore the scars of countless hours in the cotton fields. Ruth's presence particularly struck Eleanor. She was a woman of perhaps 50, though the hard life had aged her beyond her years. Her hair was completely grey, pulled back in a simple bun, and her dress was patched in several places but clean and neatly mended. Eleanor remembered seeing Ruth in the house occasionally, helping with laundry or cleaning, but had never spoken to her directly. Now, looking into Ruth's intelligent eyes, Eleanor wondered what thoughts and dreams lived behind that weathered face. "I know this is unusual," Eleanor began, her voice carrying across the silent group. "I know that in all the years you've lived here, no one from the main house has come to speak with you like this, but I need you to know that things are going to change." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Eleanor could see the skepticism in their eyes. They had heard promises before, only to see conditions worsen. She noticed how the adults instinctively moved closer to their children, a protective gesture that spoke of years of uncertainty and fear. "Mrs. Whitmore," Moses said carefully, his voice respectful but cautious. "If you don't mind me asking, what kind of changes you talking about?" Eleanor took a deep breath, aware that her next words would either give these people hope or confirm their suspicions that this was just another cruel game. "I've discovered things about this plantation, about my late husband's business practices that I cannot ignore. I've learned about families that were separated, about punishments that were—" She paused, struggling to find words for the horrors she had read about treatment that no human being should ever endure. An older man named Ezra, who worked as a carpenter and had built many of the plantation's structures, stepped forward slightly. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but what you mean by discovered? You been living here same as us. You seen what goes on." His directness surprised Eleanor, but she appreciated the honesty. "You're right, Ezra. I have been living here, but I chose not to see. I chose to look away, to tell myself that what happened in the fields and in these quarters was not my concern. I was wrong, and I'm ashamed of my willful blindness." Ruth stepped forward, her weathered face etched with decades of pain, but also with a strength that commanded respect. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but we've been knowing about those things all along. Question is, what you plan to do about it now?" The directness of Ruth's question caught Eleanor off guard, but she appreciated the honesty. "You're right, Ruth. You've known these truths while I chose to remain ignorant. But I'm here now because I want to make things right, even if it's too late for true justice." A young woman named Lily, who worked in the main house kitchen, spoke up hesitantly. "Ma'am, we heard Master Thomas been making plans. Big plans. Talk as he wants to buy more folks, build more quarters. That don't sound like things getting better for us." Eleanor's heart sank as she thought about her son's plans. The fear in Lily's voice was palpable, and Eleanor realized that news of Thomas's intentions had already spread through the quarters, creating an atmosphere of dread and uncertainty. "What about Master Thomas?" asked Sarah, shifting her baby to her other hip. "He been talking about buying more people, expanding the operation. He don't seem like he interested in any changes. Just yesterday he was asking the overseer about building new quarters, talking about how many more hands he could work if he had the space." Eleanor's heart sank as she thought about her son's plans. "Thomas doesn't know I'm here, and he doesn't know about the decision I've made." She paused, looking around at the faces watching her intently. "I want to tell you about my husband's will, and about the new will I'm having prepared." The crowd fell completely silent. Even the baby stopped fussing, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Eleanor noticed how still everyone had become. No shuffling feet, no whispered conversations, just absolute attention focused on her words. According to Jeremiah's original will, everything would pass to Thomas. The land, the house, and... She struggled with the words, "and all of you. You would continue to be treated as property, to be bought and sold at his discretion." Several people exchanged worried glances. They had all heard rumors about Thomas's plans, and none of them were encouraging. Samuel, the teenage boy, unconsciously moved closer to his mother, a woman named Clara, who worked in the laundry. Eleanor noticed the gesture and realized that even the youngest members of this community understood the precarious nature of their existence. "But I've written a new will," Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger. "One that declares all of you free, and more than that, one that leaves this entire plantation to you. The land, the house, the equipment, everything. You would own it, collectively to do with as you see fit." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor watched as the meaning of her words slowly sank in. Moses was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, are you saying what I think you saying? That you gonna give us our freedom and this land too?" "That's exactly what I'm saying, Moses. But I need you to understand what this means. Thomas will fight this decision with everything he has. There will be legal challenges and there may be violence. The other plantation owners in the area will see this as a threat to their way of life. You'll face opposition from people who believe that what I'm doing is not just wrong, but dangerous." An older woman named Patience, who had been silent until now, spoke up with a voice that carried the weight of years of suffering. "Mrs., why are you telling us this? Why are you giving us hope when you know it might all come to nothing? We've been disappointed before. We've been promised things that never came to pass." Eleanor looked at Patience, seeing in her face the accumulated pain of countless broken promises and dashed hopes. "Because you deserve to know the truth, Patience. Because you deserve to have hope, even if that hope comes with risks. And because I believe, I have to believe, that justice will prevail." Samuel, the teenage boy, stepped forward with the boldness of youth. "Why you doing this, Mrs. Whitmore? What you got to gain from giving away everything your family built?" Eleanor looked at the young man, seeing in his face the future that could be possible if her plan succeeded. "I'm doing this because it's right, Samuel. Because I've spent 40 years benefiting from a system that treated human beings as property, and I can't spend whatever years I have left perpetuating that evil." "But what about your son?" Ruth asked. "What about your own blood?" My son has chosen his path," Eleanor said sadly. "He's chosen to see people as commodities rather than as human beings. I cannot, in good conscience, leave him the means to continue that legacy." An older man named Jacob, who had been silent until now, spoke up with the practical concerns that weighed on everyone's mind. "Mrs., even if you do this thing, even if you give us our freedom and this land, how are we supposed to make it work? Most of us can't read or write. We don't know nothing about running a business or dealing with banks and lawyers. And what about the other white folks around here? They ain't gonna stand for this." Eleanor nodded, appreciating his practical concern. That's true, Jacob, and it won't be easy. But you know this land better than anyone. You know how to grow cotton, how to tend the livestock, how to maintain the buildings, and there are people, abolitionists in the north, Quaker communities, others who believe in justice, who will help you learn what you need to know. When? Sarah asked simply. When would this happen? I'm meeting with my lawyer tomorrow to finalize the new will. Once it's signed and witnessed, it becomes legally binding. If something happens to me, you'll be free, and this land will be yours. As Eleanor spoke, she noticed Thomas approaching from the direction of the main house, his face dark with anger. The enslaved people saw him too, and the group began to disperse quickly, not wanting to be caught in what was clearly going to be a confrontation. "Mother!" Thomas called out, his voice sharp with authority. "What are you doing down here? These people have work to do." Eleanor turned to face her son, drawing herself up to her full height. "I was having a conversation, Thomas, something I should have done years ago." "A conversation?" Thomas's voice dripped with disdain. "Mother, these are not people you have conversations with. They're property, and they have responsibilities. Your presence here is disruptive to the order of things." "The order of things," Eleanor repeated slowly. "Yes, Thomas, I suppose it is, and perhaps it's time that order was disrupted." As mother and son faced each other in the morning heat, the enslaved people who had gathered around Eleanor began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. A white woman of privilege, choosing to stand against everything her society held sacred, willing to sacrifice her own family for the sake of justice. The battle for the soul of Whitmore Plantation was about to begin. The tension in the Whitmore mansion was palpable as Eleanor and Thomas faced each other across the mahogany dining table that had hosted countless family meals over the decades. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. But the warmth of the light did nothing to ease the chill that had settled between mother and son. The dining room itself seemed to bear witness to their confrontation. The walls were lined with portraits of Whitmore ancestors, stern-faced men and women who had built their fortune on the backs of enslaved people. The massive table, carved from a single piece of mahogany, had been crafted by skilled enslaved artisans whose names were never recorded. The silver service that gleamed on the sideboard had been polished by countless hands that would never own anything of value themselves. Eleanor noticed these details now in a way she never had before. Every beautiful object in the room represented someone's unpaid labor, someone's stolen life. The very chairs they sat in had been built by people who would never be invited to sit at this table as guests. "I've spoken with Attorney Morrison," Thomas said, his voice carefully controlled. "He tells me you've requested a meeting to discuss Father's will. Mother, I hope you're not planning to do anything rash." Eleanor set down her teacup with deliberate precision, the delicate china making a soft clink against the saucer. "Define rash, Thomas." "Don't play games with me," Thomas snapped, his composure cracking. "Morrison mentioned you've been asking questions about property transfers and manumission papers. What exactly are you planning?" Eleanor studied her son's face, searching for any trace of the compassionate child he had once been. She remembered him as a boy, playing with the children from the quarters, seemingly oblivious to the racial barriers that would later define his worldview. When had that innocent child become this cold, calculating man? "I'm planning to right 40 years of wrongs, Thomas. I'm planning to free every enslaved person on this plantation and deed the entire property to them." The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Thomas's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, anger, and finally, cold calculation. "You've lost your mind," he said quietly. "The grief over Father's death has clearly affected your judgment. I'll speak with Dr. Henderson about having you examined." "This kind of delusion—" "I am not delusional," Eleanor interrupted, her voice steel. "I am finally seeing clearly for the first time in my life. I've read your father's papers, Thomas. I know about the families he tore apart, the children he sold, the punishments he ordered. And I've read your letter to him, outlining your plans to expand those horrors." Thomas's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Those papers were private correspondence. You had no right—" "I had every right!" Eleanor stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I was married to that man for 40 years. I lived in this house while atrocities were committed in my name. I have not just the right, but the obligation to try to make amends." "Amends?" Thomas laughed bitterly, rising to face his mother. "Mother, you're talking about giving away a fortune worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to people who are legally property. Do you understand what that means? Do you comprehend the precedent you'd be setting?" Eleanor moved to the window, looking out at the fields where people were working under the blazing sun. "I understand perfectly," she replied. "I understand that every dollar of that fortune was built on human suffering. I understand that every comfort we've enjoyed came at the cost of someone else's freedom, someone else's family, someone else's life." Thomas began pacing the room, his agitation growing with each step. His expensive boots clicked against the hardwood floor, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense atmosphere. "This is madness, Mother. Pure madness. Even if you somehow managed to execute this insane plan, do you think those people could actually run a plantation? Do you think the other landowners in Georgia would simply stand by and watch their property values plummet because you've decided to play God?" "I'm not playing God, Thomas. I'm trying to serve him." "God?" Thomas spun around to face her, his face flushed with anger. "You think God wants you to destroy everything our family has built? You think he wants you to reward laziness and ignorance with wealth they could never earn on their own?" Eleanor felt a flash of anger so intense it surprised her. "Laziness? Ignorance? Thomas, those people have worked this land for decades without compensation, without choice, without hope. They've built everything you see around you with their own hands while being treated worse than animals. How dare you call them lazy or ignorant?" "They're slaves, Mother. It's the natural order. It's what God intended when he made some people to rule and others to serve." Thomas's voice rose to nearly a shout, his careful composure completely abandoned. "No," Eleanor said firmly, her voice cutting through his tirade. "That's what men like your father told themselves to justify the unjustifiable. That's what you're telling yourself now because it's easier than admitting the truth." Thomas stopped pacing and fixed his mother with a cold stare. "And what truth is that?" "That you're afraid," Eleanor said quietly, but her words carried the force of absolute conviction. "You're afraid that without the ability to own other human beings, you might actually have to prove your worth through your own efforts. You're afraid that the people you've spent your life looking down on might be just as capable, just as intelligent, just as deserving of success as you are." The accusation hit its mark. Thomas's face flushed red, and for a moment Eleanor saw the petulant child he had once been when things didn't go his way. But the child was quickly replaced by something much more dangerous, a man whose entire worldview was being challenged. "You want to know what I'm afraid of, Mother?" Thomas's voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "I'm afraid of what happens when the natural order is destroyed. I'm afraid of what happens when slaves start believing they're equal to their betters. I'm afraid of the chaos, the violence, the complete breakdown of civilization that will follow your misguided act of charity." Eleanor shook her head sadly. "The only thing that will break down, Thomas, is a system built on cruelty and injustice. And perhaps that's exactly what needs to happen." Thomas moved closer to his mother, his eyes blazing with fury. "I will not allow you to do this," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I will fight you in court. I will have you declared mentally incompetent. I will do whatever it takes to protect what is rightfully mine." It was never rightfully yours, Thomas. It was built on theft, the theft of freedom, of dignity, of human lives. I cannot give you the means to continue that theft. Then you're choosing them over your own son? Thomas's voice cracked slightly, revealing the hurt beneath his anger. Eleanor felt her heart break a little more. For a moment, she saw not the cruel man her son had become, but the confused, angry child who felt abandoned by his mother's choice. I'm choosing what's right over what's easy. I'm choosing justice over comfort. I'm choosing to break a cycle of evil that has gone on for too long. Evil? Thomas shook his head in disbelief. Mother, slavery is legal. It's sanctioned by law, by society, by the church. How can you call it evil when it's the foundation of our entire way of life? Because legality and morality are not the same thing, Thomas. Because society can be wrong. Because the church can be corrupted by the same greed and prejudice that corrupts everything else. Eleanor moved closer to her son, her voice softening with genuine love and sorrow. Thomas, it's not too late for you to choose differently. You could support this decision. You could help make the transition work. You could be part of something good instead of perpetuating something evil. Udi. For a moment, Thomas's expression wavered, and Eleanor thought she saw a flicker of the boy she had raised. His shoulders sagged slightly, and she could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. But then his face hardened again, and she knew she had lost him. I will never support this madness, he said coldly, and I will never forgive you for choosing strangers over your own family. They're not strangers, Thomas. They're people whose lives have been intertwined with ours for decades. Sarah, who nursed you when you had scarlet fever as a child. Moses, who taught you to fish in the creek behind the house. Ruth, who made your favorite cornbread every Sunday. They're not strangers. You've just chosen to see them as less than human so you could sleep at night. Thomas's face contorted with rage at the reminder of his childhood connections to the enslaved people. Those were different times, Mother. I was a child who didn't understand the proper order of things. I've grown up. I've learned my place in the world and theirs. No, Thomas. You've learned to harden your heart. You've learned to see people as property. That's not growing up. That's becoming something less than human yourself. Thomas turned toward the door, then paused, his hand on the ornate brass handle. You have until tomorrow to reconsider this decision, Mother. After that, I'll take whatever steps are necessary to protect this family's interests. And what steps would those be, Thomas? He looked back at her with eyes that seemed to belong to a stranger. Whatever steps are necessary. The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but clearly understood. Eleanor realized that her son was capable of violence to protect what he saw as his inheritance. The thought chilled her, but it also strengthened her resolve. After Thomas left, Eleanor sank back into her chair, feeling suddenly exhausted. The confrontation had drained her emotionally, but it had also clarified something important. There could be no compromise, no middle ground. Thomas would never accept her decision, and she could never accept his vision for the plantation's future. Through the window, she could see the enslaved people working in the fields. Their movements steady and purposeful despite the oppressive heat. Tomorrow, she would meet with Attorney Morrison and sign the new will. Tomorrow, she would set in motion events that would change all their lives forever. But tonight, she would pray for the strength to see it through and for the safety of the people who were about to inherit both freedom and all the dangers that came with it. She would also pray for her son, hoping that someday he might find his way back to the compassionate child he had once been, though she feared that day might never come. The grandfather clock chimed the hour, its deep tones echoing through the mansion like a funeral bell tolling for the old way of life that was about to die forever. 3 days later, Eleanor stood on the front porch of the main house, holding the newly signed and witnessed will in her trembling hands. The document, sealed with red wax and bearing the signatures of 3 witnesses, represented more than just a legal transfer of property. It was a declaration of war against everything the antebellum South held sacred. The morning had been spent in Attorney Morrison's office, a tense affair that had tested Eleanor's resolve one final time. Morrison, a portly man in his 60s who had served the Whitmore family for over 20 years, had made one last desperate attempt to dissuade her from her course of action. "Mrs. Whitmore," he had said, mopping his brow with a handkerchief despite the cool interior of his office, "I must implore you to reconsider. The legal challenges alone will be enormous. Your son has already retained counsel, and I'm told he's prepared to contest this will on grounds of mental incompetence. Furthermore, the social and economic ramifications." But Eleanor had remained firm, her signature flowing across the document with steady strokes that belied the magnitude of what she was doing. The witnesses, a Quaker minister from Savannah, a northern businessman who had quietly supported abolition, and surprisingly, Dr. Henderson, the family physician who had examined Eleanor and declared her to be of sound mind, had added their signatures with varying degrees of enthusiasm but unanimous legal validity. Attorney Morrison had tried one last time to dissuade her, warning of the legal challenges that would surely follow and the social ostracism she would face. But Eleanor's resolve had only strengthened with each obstacle placed before her. She had spent 3 sleepless nights in prayer and contemplation, and each morning had brought greater certainty that she was doing the right thing. Now, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the plantation grounds, she had summoned everyone, enslaved and free alike, to witness what would become a moment that would be remembered for generations. The overseer, a brutal man named Caldwell, stood off to one side with several of the white workers, their faces dark with disapproval and barely concealed hostility. Eleanor had already informed Caldwell that his services would no longer be required, a decision that had sent him into a rage that she had weathered with surprising calm. Thomas stood to her left, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. He had spent the past 3 days consulting with lawyers and influential friends, building his case to have the will overturned. But Eleanor had been thorough in her preparations, ensuring that every legal requirement was met, every potential challenge anticipated. His expensive suit was immaculate as always, but his eyes held a wildness that spoke of desperation and fury. To her right stood Moses, Sarah, Ruth, Samuel, Jacob, Samuel, and nearly 50 other people who had never imagined they might one day own the very land they had worked without compensation for so long. Their faces showed a mixture of hope, disbelief, and fear. Hope for a future they had never dared dream of. Disbelief that such a thing could actually happen, and fear of what might come next. The assembled crowd was larger than Eleanor had expected. Word of the unusual gathering had spread beyond the plantation, and several neighboring landowners had arrived to witness what they clearly viewed as either a spectacle or a threat. Their carriages lined the drive, and their disapproving faces formed a wall of hostility that Eleanor could feel like a physical presence. "My friends," Eleanor began, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, "today marks the end of one chapter in the history of this plantation and the beginning of another. For too long, this land has been a place of bondage, of suffering, of injustice. Today, it becomes something different, a place of freedom, of opportunity, of hope." A murmur ran through the crowd of white observers, some of whom began to mutter among themselves. Eleanor could hear fragments of their conversations, words like madness, dangerous precedent, and ought to be stopped. But she pressed on, her voice growing stronger. She held up the document, its official seals glinting in the sunlight. "This will declares that upon my death, Every person currently held in slavery on this plantation will be immediately and unconditionally free. Furthermore, it deeds the entire property, all 300 acres, the main house, the outbuildings, the equipment, and all other assets, to you collectively, to be owned and operated as you see fit. A gasp went up from the crowd. Even though Eleanor had spoken with many of them individually over the past few days, hearing the words spoken officially in front of everyone made it real in a way that private conversations could not. Several of the white observers began talking loudly among themselves, their voices rising in indignation. "This is an outrage," shouted Colonel Pemberton, owner of the neighboring Magnolia Grove plantation. "This woman has clearly taken leave of her senses. Such an action threatens the stability of our entire region." Eleanor turned to face the colonel, her voice calm but firm. "Colonel Pemberton, you are welcome to observe these proceedings, but you are not welcome to disrupt them. This is my property, and these are my decisions to make. But I'm not waiting for my death to begin this process," Eleanor continued, turning back to the enslaved people. "As of this moment, I am declaring all of you free. The legal documents have been filed with the county courthouse. You are no longer slaves. You are free men and women with all the rights and responsibilities that freedom entails." The silence that followed was profound. Then, slowly, Ruth began to weep, not the silent tears of sorrow that had marked so many years of her life, but tears of joy that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. Moses removed his hat and fell to his knees, his weathered hands clasped in prayer. Sarah clutched her baby tighter, whispering words of gratitude that only her child could hear. The emotional response spread through the group like wildfire. Men who had never been allowed to show vulnerability wept openly. Women who had spent their lives in fear began to laugh with pure joy. Children who didn't fully understand what was happening sensed the momentous nature of the occasion and clung to their parents with wide, wondering eyes. "This is illegal!" Thomas suddenly shouted, his composure finally cracking completely. "Mother, you cannot simply declare people free. There are laws, procedures, requirements that must be met." Eleanor turned to face her son with sad but determined eyes. "The manumission papers have been properly filed, Thomas. Attorney Morrison may disapprove of my decision, but he has confirmed that it is entirely legal." "Legal, perhaps, but not binding." Thomas stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "I am your heir, your only child. I will contest this will, and I will win. No court in Georgia will allow this travesty to stand." "You may try, Thomas," Eleanor replied quietly. "But you will find that I have been very thorough. The will is ironclad, witnessed by 3 respected members of the community, and filed with all appropriate authorities. More importantly, the manumission papers take effect immediately. Regardless of any future legal challenges, these people are free as of this moment." Colonel Pemberton stepped forward, his face red with indignation. "Mrs. Whitmore, I demand that you reconsider this reckless action. The economic implications alone—" "Colonel," Eleanor interrupted, her voice carrying an authority that surprised even her, "I did not ask for your opinion, and I do not require your approval. These people have worked this land for decades without compensation. They have earned their freedom 1,000 times over." Samuel, the teenage boy who had questioned Eleanor's motives just days before, stepped forward with tears streaming down his face. "Mrs. Whitmore, we don't know how to thank you. We don't even know how to be free. All we ever known is this place, this life." Eleanor's heart swelled with emotion as she looked at the young man. "You'll learn, Samuel. You're all stronger and more capable than you know. And you won't be alone. There are people who will help you, organizations in the North that support freed slaves, Quaker communities that will provide guidance and assistance. What about the other plantations? asked Jacob, ever practical. "What about the other owners? They ain't gonna like this one bit." Eleanor nodded gravely, glancing at the hostile faces of the white observers. "You're right, Jacob. This decision will make enemies of people who were once friends. There will be attempts to intimidate you, to force you to sell the land for far less than it's worth, or to abandon it altogether. You'll need to be strong, to stand together, to protect what you've been given." "We will," Moses said, rising slowly to his feet. "We've been protecting each other all our lives. Now we got something to protect that's truly ours." As the reality of the situation began to sink in, the freed slaves began to embrace each other, their voices rising in a mixture of laughter, tears, and prayers of thanksgiving. For the first time in their lives, they were looking at a future that belonged to them. But even as they celebrated, Eleanor noticed several white men on horseback approaching from the main road. Word of her decision had already begun to spread, and the reaction from the neighboring plantation owners was swift and predictable. She recognized several of them, men who had dined at her table, who had courted her favor when Jeremiah was alive, who now looked at her with undisguised hatred. "Thomas," she said quietly, "I suggest you leave now. What's about to happen here won't be pleasant, and I don't want you caught in the middle of it." Her son looked at her with a mixture of hatred and something that might have been grief. "You've destroyed everything, Mother. Everything our family built, everything we stood for. I hope you're satisfied." "I'm not satisfied, Thomas," Eleanor replied sadly. "I'm heartbroken that it took me so long to do what was right. I'm heartbroken that you can't see the beauty in what's happening here today, but I'm at peace with my decision." Thomas turned and walked away without another word, heading toward the stables where his horse waited. Eleanor watched him go, knowing that she might never see her son again, but also knowing that she had chosen the only path her conscience would allow. As the riders drew closer, Eleanor turned back to the people she had just freed. "Remember," she said, her voice strong and clear, "you are no longer slaves. You are free citizens, and this is your land. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Moses stepped forward and took Eleanor's hand in his weathered ones. "Mrs. Whitmore, you've done something today that's going to change the world. Maybe not the whole world right away, but our world, and that's a start." Eleanor squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of decades of unpaid labor. "No, Moses, you're going to change the world. I've just given you the tools to do it." As the sun began to set over Whitmore Plantation, soon to be renamed Freedom Plantation by its new owners, Eleanor Whitmore stood surrounded by the people she had chosen over her own son, over her own social standing, over her own comfort. She had given up everything she had once thought mattered, and in return she had gained something far more valuable, the knowledge that she had finally, after 40 years of complicity, chosen justice over convenience. The road ahead would be difficult. There would be legal challenges, economic hardships, and violent opposition from those who saw this act of liberation as a threat to their way of life. But for the first time in decades, Eleanor felt truly free herself. Free from the weight of guilt, free from the burden of participating in evil, free to face whatever consequences came with the knowledge that she had done the right thing. As the freed slaves began to plan their future, discussing how to organize their new community, how to divide the land fairly, and how to protect themselves from those who would try to take it away, Eleanor smiled through her tears. She had witnessed the birth of something beautiful, a community of free people working together, building something better on the foundation of what had once been a monument to human cruelty. The plantation lady had indeed disinherited her son and left everything to her slaves. But more than that, she had given them something that no amount of money could buy, the chance to write their own story, to build their own future, to prove that freedom and justice were worth any sacrifice. 6 months later, Freedom Plantation had become a beacon of hope in a region still dominated by the institution of slavery. Under the collective leadership of Moses, Ruth, and several other community elders, the former slaves had not only maintained the plantation's productivity, but had actually increased it, proving that free labor motivated by ownership was far more effective than forced labor motivated by fear. The community had established a school where both children and adults learned to read and write, taught by a young Quaker woman named Rebecca, who had come south specifically to help with the transition. They had formed a council to make collective decisions about the land use and resource allocation, demonstrating a level of democratic organization that surprised and threatened their white neighbors. Eleanor Whitmore lived to see her decision vindicated, spending her final years as a welcomed member of the community she had helped create. When she passed away peacefully in 1862, she was mourned not as a former slave owner, but as a liberator, a woman who had chosen courage over comfort and justice over tradition. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, both black and white, who had been touched by her transformation. Thomas Whitmore's legal challenges ultimately failed, and he left Georgia in disgrace, never to return. The community that grew from his mother's radical act of justice would go on to become one of the most successful cooperative farms in the post-Civil War South, serving as a model for what was possible when human dignity was valued over human bondage. The story of Eleanor Whitmore reminds us that it's never too late to choose what's right, even when that choice costs us everything we thought we valued. In a world where injustice often seems insurmountable, her legacy stands as proof that one person's courage to do what's right can change not just individual lives, but the course of history itself. If this story moved you as much as it moved me, please subscribe to our channel and share it with others. Stories like Eleanor's remind us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose courage over comfort. What would you be willing to sacrifice to do what's right? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that notification bell for more incredible stories of human courage and redemption.